Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Our today's session is on the novel Emma, and in this session we would continue with the text, story and critical analysis of the leftover part of volume 3. Before I move forward, I would like to share a quick review of the previous lesson. We started volume 3 of the novel. We started from chapter 37 and we have covered till chapter 45 in the previous lesson. We looked at important happenings in these chapters, points of discussion, important points of text with reference to the development of various characters were also explored. Jane Austen as a writer and her art of characterization were discussed. I talked about the development of different themes through these chapters and commented on the writing style of Austen. As far as today's session is concerned, in today's session we will cover from chapter 46 to chapter 55. Thus, in today's session we will finish the analysis of the novel Emma. So we come to chapter 46 as we continue with volume 3 of the novel. In this chapter, let's see what happens. Mr. Weston requests Emma to come to Randall's on urgent basis as she has some important news. Mr. Weston arrives to escort Emma to see Mrs. Weston. Emma is worried about what has happened to Mrs. Weston, but Mr. Weston assures her that she is well. Now Emma starts worrying about Isabella's family and for Mr. Knightley in London, but Mr. Weston again assures her that the news does not involve any of them. When Emma reaches Randall's, she is greeted by Mrs. Weston and Mrs. Weston looks quite disturbed. She has the news that Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, they have been secretly engaged. Emma tells Mrs. Weston honestly that she was once interested in Frank, but she quickly relieves Mrs. Weston by assuring her that she has no more feelings for Frank. However, she is upset that Frank pretended to show affection for her when he was already engaged to Jane, particularly when Jane was present around. Emma is also embarrassed by the things she had said to Frank about Jane and furthermore is concerned for Harriet's feelings. So there is not much, one worry that would worry Emma. There are a lot of things. It is her concern for Harriet. It is about her concern for her reputation that she has spoiled for herself by talking to Frank, saying certain things about Jane. Mrs. Weston defends her stepson, telling Emma that there were misunderstandings between him and Jane and that he will be writing her a letter explaining the details. Mr. Churchill has given his consent to the match, but he wants it to be a secret for a while. Emma assures him as well that the news of Frank's engagement has not disturbed her. Here is some text that is in the context of the meeting between Emma and Mrs. Weston. "Have you indeed no idea," said Mrs. Weston in a trembling voice. "Cannot you, my dear Emma, cannot you form a guess as to what you are to hear?" "So far as that it relates to Mr. Frank Churchill, I do guess." So she already knows that. "You are right, it does relate to him and I will tell you directly." Resuming her work and seeming resolved against looking up, "He has been there this very morning on a most extraordinary errand. It is impossible to express our surprise. He came to speak to his father on a subject, to announce an attachment." She stopped to breathe. Emma thought first of herself and then of Harriet. "More than an attachment indeed," resumed Mrs. Weston. "An engagement, a positive engagement. What will you say, Emma? What will anybody say? When it is known that Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax are engaged, nay, that they have been long engaged." So the news she thinks she breaks to Emma. Emma even jumped with surprise and horror-struck, exclaimed, "Jane Fairfax, good God, you are not serious. You do not mean it." "You may well be amazed," returned Mrs. Weston, still averting her eyes and talking on with eagerness that Emma might have time to recover. You may well be amazed, but it is even so. There has been a solemn engagement between them ever since October, formed at Weymouth and kept a secret from everybody. Not a creature knowing it but themselves, neither the Campbells nor her family nor his. It is so wonderful that though perfectly convinced of the fact, it is yet almost incredible to myself. I can hardly believe it. I thought I knew him. The text continues. Emma scarcely heard what was said. Her mind was divided between two ideas, her own former conversations with him about Miss Fairfax and poor Harriet, and for some time she should only exclaim and require confirmation, repeated confirmation. Well, said she at last, trying to recover herself, this is a circumstance which I must think of at least half a day before I can at all comprehend it. What, engaged to her all the winter before either of them came to Highbury? Engaged since October, secretly engaged. It has hurt me. So she makes it clear that she is hurt with this. It has hurt me, Emma, very much. This is what Mrs. Weston is saying. It has hurt his father equally. Some part of his conduct we cannot excuse. She is trying to explain it to Emma, how very much she is hurt by this, how much the family, how much the father is hurt by this, and actually in doing all this she is trying to console Emma. Emma pondered a moment and then replied, I will not pretend not to understand you and to give you all the relief in my power. Be assured that no such effect has followed his attentions to me as you are apprehensive of. Emma उसको बड़े आराम से बता देती है कि she was not interested in Frank at all after her very initial slight involvement, and this engagement doesn't make a difference to her. Mrs. Weston looked up, afraid to believe, but Emma's countenance was as steady as her words. The text continues on this slide as well. That you may have less difficulty in believing this boast of my present perfect indifference, she said, I will farther tell you that there was a period in the early part of our acquaintance when I did like him, when I was very much disposed to be attached to him. Nay, was attached, and how it came to cease is perhaps the wonder. Fortunately, however, it did cease. I have really for some time past, for at least these 3 months, cared nothing about him. You may believe me, Mrs. Weston, this is the simple truth. So she is trying to reassure Mrs. Weston. Mrs. Weston kissed her with tears of joy, and when she could find utterance, assured her that this protestation had done her more good than anything else in the world could do. Now she feels relieved. Mr. Weston will be almost as much relieved as myself, said she. So Mrs. Weston is not only happy that Emma is not disturbed by the news of the engagement of Frank, but also she is relieved that this news would provide a kind of relief to Mr. Weston as well, who is worried about this. On this point we have been wretched. It was our darling wish that you might be attached to each other, and we were persuaded that it was so. Imagine that what we have been feeling on our account. She is explaining all that. I have escaped, and that I should escape may be a matter of grateful wonder to you and myself, but this does not acquit him, Mrs. Weston, and I must say that I think him greatly to blame. So what Emma says is that, well, she was not interested in him, but it does not mean that he is not to be blamed. She criticizes him by saying, what right had he to come among us with affection and faith engaged, and with manners so very disengaged? What right had he to endeavour to please, as he certainly did, to distinguish any one young woman with preserving attention, as he certainly did, while he really belonged to another? How could he tell what mischief he might be doing? How could he tell that he might not be making me in love with him? Very wrong indeed. So she very harshly criticizes Frank for doing what he did. When it comes to important discussion points with reference to this chapter, I would say that the chapter is designed around the debate whether or not Frank Churchill was wrong in devoting his attention to Emma and hiding his engagement to Jane Fairfax. As Emma points out, he came to Highbury with professions of openness and simplicity, but instead duped everyone. Still, it was evident from his first introduction that Frank harbored some secret and was deliberately deceptive. And although he gave the appearance that he had an interest in Emma, she realized almost immediately that this was not so. And it was an interest that was more out of vanity than their shared passion. It was more about the shared sociability than actually love. One of the positive impacts of the engagement is that Jane Fairfax will no longer have to become, she would have to otherwise, that is, she would not have to work as a maid or as a governess. This leads us to chapter 47, and let's see what happens in chapter 47. After criticizing Frank for what he has done, after clarifying it to Mrs. Weston that she herself is not interested anymore in Frank, now Harriet is a source of concern for Emma in this chapter. Emma, in fact, is very much concerned for Harriet. She is angrier at herself than she is at Frank, because she believes that she encouraged Harriet to be involved, to think about Frank. She believes that she should have discouraged Harriet's attachment to him. Emma also realizes why Jane has been avoiding her, because she has seen her as a rival. So Emma is worried how she would break the news to Harriet. However, when Harriet arrives at Halffield, she already knows the story that is told to her by Mr. Weston. तो एटलीस्ट इतना हम कह सकते हैं कि अब एमा को उसे सब कुछ बताना नहीं पड़ेगा. Emma is surprised at Harriet's composure, and it turns out that Harriet never cared for Frank. She has been harboring feelings for Mr. Knightley. Harriet knows that Mr. Knightley is of higher rank than she, but she affirms that Emma has given her hope that she may raise herself enough to be acceptable to him. अगर आपको याद हो, बिल्कुल शुरू में in my first lecture, in my introductory session on this course, I talked about the novel, and I talked about the women of the times, and I talked about the Victorian novel, and I said how women were supposed to marry in higher social status families in order to raise their status. The same we see happening here in this novel. Throughout, efforts are being made by Emma and by Harriet herself even to get Harriet married to somebody who is higher in social rank so that she can have a better social standing. Emma takes a startling discovery. She herself is in love with Mr. Knightley. Now that Harriet claims that she doesn't love Frank, actually she loves Mr. Knightley, Emma is surprised and shocked at the discovery of her own love for Mr. Knightley. She conceals her emotion from Harriet, asking Harriet whether she has reason to believe that Mr. Knightley returns her feelings. Harriet recounts a number of instances in which Mr. Knightley has shown her special attention, many of which Emma's memory corroborates. When Harriet departs, Emma is left to reflect that she has been wrong about everything, including her own heart. Now Knightley may debase himself by marrying Harriet, and she has made it all possible. The process of learning of Emma is taking place. She is gradually realizing all her flaws, all her mistakes. However, one important thing that I noticed at this point is that even now the class consciousness is there, and she thinks that if Knightley marries Harriet, what would happen? He would be degrading or disgracing himself by marrying a woman who belongs to a comparatively lower class. This becomes very, very ironic in the context where she herself has been always trying to find a suitable match for Harriet in a comparatively upper class social status family. Here is some opening text of this chapter. Harriet, poor Harriet, those were the words. In them lay the tormenting ideas which Emma could not get rid of, and which constituted the real misery of the business to her. Frank Churchill had behaved very ill by herself, very ill in many ways, but it was not so much his behavior as her own which made her so angry with him. She is blaming herself. It was she who pushed Harriet to think about Frank. It was the scrap which he had drawn into her drawn her into on Harriet's account that gave the deepest hue to his offense. Poor Harriet, this is what Emma is thinking, to be a second time the dupe of her misconceptions and flattery. Mr. Knightley had spoken prophetically when he once said, "Emma, you have been no friend to Harriet Smith." She was afraid she had done her nothing but disservice. So the realization is gradually coming to Emma. It was true that she had not to charge herself, in this instance as in the former, with being the sole and original author of the mischief, with having suggested some feelings as might otherwise never have entered Harriet's imagination. For Harriet had acknowledged her admiration and preference of Frank Churchill before she had even given her a hint on the subject. But she felt completely guilty of having encouraged what she might have repressed. So now Emma blames herself that she should have discouraged Harriet to be involved with Frank, or to think about Frank. She might have prevented the indulgence and increase of such sentiments. Her influence would have been enough. And now she was conscious that she ought to have prevented them. She felt that she had been risking her friend's happiness on most insufficient grounds. Common sense would have directed her to tell Harriet that she must not allow herself to think of him and that there were 500 chances to 1 against his ever caring for her. लेकिन क्या करें कि उस वक्त Emma was blind to this common sense view. But with common sense, she added, "I am afraid I have had little to do." Self-realization is there. खुद कह रही है कि she didn't have that common sense. She was extremely angry with herself. If she could not have been angry with Frank Churchill too, it would have been dreadful. So one thing we notice, no matter whatsoever wrong and howsoever wrong she does to Harriet, finally I think we can say that yes, no matter whatsoever it is, she really cares for Harriet because again she is worried about her feelings. वो जो कहते हैं ना कि नादान दोस्त से अक्लमंद दुश्मन बेहतर होता है, so this is exactly the case. Here Harriet has Emma as claiming friendship. Emma who thinks she is very wise but who actually is not wise in terms of matchmaking that she does. Here is some part of the text that brings some more discoveries. "Me," cried Harriet, coloring and astonished. "Why should you caution me?" Now, अब ये कहाँ किस point से मैंने text उठाया है, where Emma is trying to clarify things in front of Harriet and saying that she is to be blamed for not actually warning or not giving a caution to Harriet in that regard. The response of Harriet is very, very surprising, rather shocking for Emma. Let's see what Harriet says. She says, "Me?" Coloring and astonished, Harriet cried that, "Why should you caution me? You do not think I care about Mr. Frank Churchill." "I am delighted to hear you speak so stoutly on the subject," replied Emma, smiling, "but you do not mean to deny that there was a time, and not very distant either, when you gave me reason to understand that you did care about him." "Him? Never, never." "Dear Miss Woodhouse, how could you so mistake me?" Turning away distressed. "Harriet," cried Emma after a moment's pause, "what do you mean?" "Good heaven, what do you mean? Mistake you? Am I to suppose then?" She could not speak another word. Her voice was lost and she sat down waiting in great terror till Harriet should answer. Now she started realizing that maybe Harriet was thinking about somebody else of higher rank. Harriet, who was standing at some distance and with face turned from her, did not immediately say anything, and when she did speak, it was in a voice nearly as agitated as Emma's. "I should not have thought it possible," she began, "that you could have misunderstood me. I know we agreed never to name him, but considering how infinitely superior he is to everybody else, I should not have thought it possible that I could be supposed to mean any other person. Mr. Frank Churchill, indeed, I don't know who would ever look at him in the company of the other." अब एमा पे रिवील होने जा रहा है बेसिकली कि हैरियट is thinking about somebody else, not Frank Churchill. I hope I have a better taste than to think of Mr. Frank Churchill, who is like nobody by his side, and that you should have been so mistaken is amazing, I'm sure. But for believing that you entirely approved and meant to encourage me in my attachment, I should have considered it at first too great a presumption almost to dare to think of him. At first, you had not told me that more wonderful things had happened, that there had been matches of greater disparity. Those were your very words. Ab, what we notice is that Harriet blame कर रही है, इल्ज़ाम लगा रही है, basically on Emma, that it was Emma who made her think like this, that there could be such wonderful matches where young women could be married to men of far greater or higher fortune. And she says, but if you who had been always acquainted with him, she says that I should not have thought it possible, but if you who had always been acquainted with him would have made me think of that. Harriet, cried Emma, collecting herself resolutely, let us understand each other now, without the possibility of further mistake. Are you speaking of Mr. Knightley? उसको अभी भी यकीन नहीं आ रहा कि actually she is interested in Mr. Knightley. To be sure I am. I never could have an idea of anybody else, and so I thought you knew. When we talked about him, it was as clear as possible. Not quite, returned Emma with forced calmness, for all that you then said appeared to me to relate to a different person. उस वक्त उसे ये लगा था ना कि फ्रैंक की बात कर रही है. I could almost assert that you had named Mr. Frank Churchill. I am sure the service Mr. Frank Churchill had rendered you in protecting you from the gypsies was spoken of. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how do you forget? My dear Harriet, I perfectly remember the substance of what I said on the occasion. I told you that I did not wonder at your attachment, that considering the service he had rendered you, it was extremely natural, and you agreed to it, expressing yourself very warmly as to your sense of that service, and mentioning even that your sensations had been in seeing him come forward to your rescue. The impression of it is strong on my memory. अब वो दोनों बहस कर रही हैं. What Emma believes is that she talked about Frank Churchill and her rescue by him from the gypsies. Let's see what Harriet says. Harriet is here. Oh dear, cried Harriet, now I recollect what you mean, but I was thinking of something very different at that time. It was not the gypsies, it was Mr. Frank Churchill, not it was Frank Churchill that I meant. No, with some elevation, I was thinking of a much more precious circumstance of Mr. Knightley's coming and asking me to dance when Mr. Elton would not stand up with me and when there was no other partner in the room. So this was the event that she was referring to, and that was mistakenly misinterpreted by Emma. That was the kind action, that was the noble benevolence and generosity, that was the service which made me begin to feel how superior he was to every other being upon earth. Good God, cried Emma, this has been a most unfortunate, most deplorable mistake. Well, dear students, I've read quite a long extract from the chapter in order to give you an idea of how this misunderstanding was created between the two, that is between Emma and Harriet. When we come to some important discussion points, Emma's concern about Harriet is manifest through the following. She cares for her, she thinks herself responsible for her, she wants her to be happy. Still, she misinterprets her emotions and feelings. Even Mr. Knightley's words to Emma, you have been no friend to Harriet Smith, that proved to be prophetic, are actually understood by her quite late. Two important themes that I would like to point out here are number one of jealousy and number two of class distinction. The issues of jealousy we can see here. Emma, who has always been trying to make a match of Harriet with somebody of higher status, now that she comes to know that Harriet is interested in Mr. Knightley, she says about that this is the most unfortunate thing. Why does she say that? Is it, we question as readers, is it because she herself is interested in Knightley? So it is out of jealousy on these grounds that actually she does not want Harriet to think about Mr. Knightley. The second issue is of class distinction. So far, Emma has always been trying to place Harriet in a higher social status position by getting her married to somebody who is of higher social status. Now that amongst the eligible bachelors around, the most eligible, the most elite bachelor who is around, that is Mr. Knightley, when Harriet shows interest in him, it is the point where Emma finds it a mistake. She thinks of it as the greatest of the misfortunes, that she misunderstood all that, that she misinterpreted all that. Issues of class distinction come in. At this point where she herself is thinking about Mr. Knightley, she thinks of class distinction for the first time as a barrier for Harriet, and she doesn't want Mr. Knightley to get married to a younger like Harriet who does not have any social standing. This brings us to chapter 48. Emma thinks about what happened during the past months. She realizes that it has always been important to her to be first with Mr. Knightley, and that he has always shown a special kind of concern for her. However, she wonders if he could return her feelings. Emma also feels that by being rude to Miss Bates, she has made him so very much angry that he would not think about such things. Emma gives up hope that Mr. Knightley is in love with her. Even if he were, she would still not be able to marry him because her father constantly needs her attention. She still believes she would not marry him even if he asked, because she cannot leave her father. She anticipates having the opportunity to observe him and Harriet together. Mrs. Weston reports that she has just visited with Jane, and that Jane admits that by keeping her engagement secret, she has done wrong. Now she regrets being involved in a suspicious private engagement and wishes that she had handled the situation with more grace. What we see is that the strands are being brought together, the mysteries are being resolved, and the story is smoothly moving towards a neat ending. As Emma hears all this, she feels more angry towards Frank. Mrs. Weston again defends him, though she has not yet received his explanatory letter, but Emma is too distracted by her thoughts about Mr. Knightley to pay attention to what Mrs. Weston is talking about, Frank and his reasons of doing what he did. Emma regrets once more that she could not be a very good friend to Jane, as Knightley had advised her to do. She is afraid that life will be dull, boring and meaningless without Mr. Knightley's constant visits to Harfield. Actually, she realizes that she has got used to his visits. Thus, she feels disheartened and alone. Before we move forward, dear students, I would just like to say that so far the novel's narrative speed has increased and it is moving towards a closure. Now we see development in Emma on an explicit level. Before this, what we had noticed was that she was learning on an implicit level. The learning was not clear, was not obvious. Now she for the first time accepts her mistakes, accepts her inability to understand situations, accepts her failure in making matches properly. Frank and Jane's relationship and related issues are also resolved, so this strand of the story is clearly given neat move towards ending. Social class consciousness on the other part of Harriet can be noticed. She herself realizes that Mr. Knightley is too high to think about as a match for a girl like Harriet. Emma's realization of her love for Mr. Knightley makes Emma's previous inability to discover the truth about her feelings nullified at this stage. So for the first time, she is understanding herself. She is able to know what she actually wants. This brings us to chapter 49. In this chapter, we see that Emma goes for a walk in the garden, and to her surprise, Mr. Knightley joins her. He has just returned from London and he stops by Harfield to see Emma actually. And as they walk, she offers her news about Frank and Jane's secret engagement. She thinks that she's breaking the news to him, but Knightley already knows about it. Both of them discuss Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax quite in detail. And I think for the first time we would notice that they are talking on the same wavelength. They have the same views about Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. He tries to console Emma, but she asserts that she has never been feeling for Frank, and she explains and expresses regret for her behavior. On all this, Mr. Knightley is strangely silent. Finally, he admits that he may have underrated Frank and expresses envy at his circumstances. In fact, she worries that Knightley will confess his feelings for Harriet. Worried that Knightley is about to discuss Harriet, actually Emma quickly silences him, and he is very much mortified by this. And seeing his pain, Emma finally invites him to speak after all, saying she will be glad to hear him as a friend, whereas he says that he does not wish her friendship, and he finally declares his love for Emma. This is a surprise for Emma. She is very much surprised at this, and both of them are now reassured of their love for one another. So finally the protagonist, the female protagonist of the novel, Emma, who is very much independent, who is such a powerful independent woman, who doesn't want to get married, who keeps on announces she would never marry, we see her falling in love, and soon maybe we would see her talking to Mr. Knightley about their marriage. When it comes to important discussion points with relation to this chapter, I would say that the relationship of Emma and Mr. Knightley becomes clear. He forgives Frank. He professes love in a measured and utterly dignified manner that I would say suits his personality. Mr. Knightley's declaration of his love to Emma contrasts starkly with Mr. Elton's elaborate compliments, and then with Frank's light playful flirtations. पिछले दोनों जो उसके experiences थे, one with Mr. Elton, the other with Frank, they were completely different. Mr. Knightley is very much dignified and graceful as he expresses his love. He says, I cannot make speeches, Emma. If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more. But you know what I am. You hear nothing but truth from me. Yes, you see, you understand my feelings. So one of the messages of the novel is that such sincere, direct expressions are more valuable than ornate speeches that are made by the other suitors, that is Mr. Elton and Mr. Frank. Mr. Knightley already understands her and appreciates her. The question arises, why then he always found faults with her? Well, his criticism of her was his concerns as a friend, and also his criticism was a preparation for making her a suitable wife, to bring her to the role of his own wife as prepared for that role. This brings us to chapter 50. Emma can barely conceal her feelings as she and Mr. Knightley join her father for tea. That night, Emma lies awake worrying about Harriet and her father. As she thinks of the possibility of her marriage, there are two hindrances or issues in this regard. One is her father and his health, as she cannot think of leaving him alone or causing him any kind of inconvenience. Her second worry is about Harriet. She wonders how to disclose the news to Harriet about her own involvement with Mr. Knightley. She decides she will write a letter to Harriet explaining what has happened and arrange for Harriet to visit Isabella in London to create some distraction for her and to give both of them some time to adjust to the new situation. She decides that she and Knightley must postpone their wedding until her father is alive so that she could stay with her father. Well, couple of things about Emma. Number one, that genuinely she is concerned about Harriet, despite her that streak or sense of jealousy that she naturally had when Harriet announced her interest in Mr. Knightley. What we notice is that genuinely Emma cares for Harriet, so she is still worried about her, and she wonders how she would disclose the news about her own involvement with Mr. Knightley to Harriet. Secondly, she is genuinely worried about and concerned about her father, and she wants to delay the marriage so that she could live with her father and could take care of her. Mrs. Weston forwards Emma a letter from Frank in which he explains that all of his actions, including his attentions to Emma, were out of his efforts to keep his engagement to Jane a secret. He apologizes for his behavior by giving a detailed explanation. So this strand of the story also becomes clear, and he informs her about their reconciliation and admits that he is happier than he deserves to be. This brings us to chapter 51 of the novel. We notice that already the story has come to an end, and it is only in terms of giving it a neat ending that Jane Austen is adding a few more details to give a neat closure. In this chapter anyhow, what we notice is that Emma is so happy in her personal life that she forgives Frank. When Knightley comes to her, she shares the letter with him as well. Mr. Knightley and Emma discuss Frank Churchill's letter and come to the same conclusion that though Frank Churchill did not behave well, he was partially justified, especially since there has been no final harm, so he can be forgiven. Now Emma and Mr. Knightley, they have discussions. Actually, he and Emma discuss her father and the options regarding how and where to settle him after their marriage, because one thing that is clear is that Emma does not want to leave her father alone. Mr. Knightley agrees that Emma cannot leave Harfield and that Mr. Woodhouse cannot be expected to move to Donwell Abbey, that is the place of Mr. Knightley. So he suggests that he can move to Harfield to save Emma's father from any inconvenience. Emma is of course emotionally very much touched by this sacrifice. Now her only worry is Harriet. She apprehends that this engagement and relocation will increase distance between her and Harriet. Well, here are some important discussion points with reference to a critical analysis of this chapter. The first thing is Emma's unique status. Jane Austen in this chapter actually returns to the theme that Emma has the societal power of a man. Rather than a single young woman, she is powerful like a man, and in this way the relationship between Emma and Mr. Knightley reverses those traditional gender roles. That is why we see that Mr. Knightley is the one who makes sacrifice and who just is ready to modify the customs and behavior and says that he would move to their house, that is Emma's house, after marriage. It is who must give up his home to move elsewhere upon marriage. That usually does not happen in Jane Austen's contexts. So this shows Emma's unique, powerful, strong position in the society. Social dynamics of Emma's world are also important. The considerations that the two of them make about their marriage reinforce the social dynamic in Highbury. A marriage between Mr. Knightley and Emma affects more than just these two people. It affects Mr. Woodhouse, who might lose the daughter who cares for him. It affects Isabella's son Henry, who now might lose his place as the inheritor of Donwell Abbey if Emma and Mr. Knightley produce a heir. This particular situation also affects Harriet Smith, who once again must bear the pain of rejection from a man who is too socially superior for her to rightfully consider. This leads us to chapter 52 of this novel. Emma does not want to hurt Harriet with the news of Emma and Mr. Knightley's engagement. She wants to send Harriet to London so that she is away for a while and can forget all this easily. Harriet also agrees to Emma's plan to send her to London on the pretense that she needs to see a dentist, and this situation satisfies Emma. Emma decides not to tell her father of her engagement until Mrs. Weston, who is pregnant, has given birth to her baby. So she also pays a visit to Jane, and they are unable to speak openly because of the presence of Mrs. Elton there. However, as Emma leaves and Jane walks her out, they are reconciled, having a goodwill for each other. So this part of the story is again given a very, very neat ending where all the grudges, all the jealousies are over, and Emma and Jane can see each other in a far better light. This brings us to chapter 53 of the novel. This chapter tells it that Mrs. Weston gives birth to a baby girl. That makes Emma very happy. Emma and Mr. Knightley publicly announce the news of their engagement. Mr. John Knightley, that is the brother of Mr. Knightley, and he congratulates them and he asserts that he knew it would happen. He is not surprised by the news. This is what he says. Emma musters up the courage to give her father the news. Mr. Woodhouse is shocked initially, but gradually he begins to resign himself to it, and we hope that he would soon take the news in a better way. Emma tells Mr. Knightley that she cannot call him by his first name, but promises to call him George after they are married. So they are coming closer. Well, dear students, here on the slide you can see some selected part of the text that is about the news that she reveals to her father about her engagement with Mr. Knightley. The time was coming when the news must spread farther, and other person's reception of it tried. As soon as Mrs. Weston was sufficiently recovered to admit Mr. Woodhouse's visits, Emma, having it in view that her gentle reasonings should be employed in the cause, resolved first to announce it at home and then at Randall's. But how to break it to her father at last? She had bound herself to do it in such an hour of Mr. Knightley's absence, or when it came to the point, her heart would have failed her, and she must have put it off, but Mr. Knightley was to come at such a time and follow up the beginning she was to make. So she was planning for how she would reveal this news to her father. She was forced to speak, and to speak cheerfully too. She must not make it a more decided subject of misery to him by a melancholy tone herself. She must not appear to think it a misfortune. With all the spirit she could command, she prepared him first for something strange, and then in a few words said that if his consent and approbation could be obtained, which she trusted would be attended with no difficulty, since it was a plan to promote the happiness of all, she and Mr. Knightley meant to marry, by which means Harfield would receive the constant addition of what person's company whom she knew he loved, next to his daughters and Mrs. Weston, best in the world. अब बड़ी tactfully उसने वो news उसको बताई है, पहले उसको prepare किया है कि this would add somebody to the family who is someone that he really likes after Emma and Mrs. Weston, the third person that he would love to be in the company of. और फिर ये कह के कि I'm going to tell you something strange, mentally preparing him for all that, और फिर उसने वो news उसके लिए she reveals that news. Anyhow, the text continues. Poor man, it was at first a considerable shock to him, and he tried earnestly to dissuade her from it. She was reminded more than once of having always said she would never marry, and assured that it would be a great deal better for her to remain single, and told of poor Isabella and poor Miss Taylor. अच्छा वो the father अब उसकी वहीं पर सुई अटकी हुई है ना, वो बार बार ये because he doesn't want his life to be changed, वो बार बार वही बात कह रहा है कि poor Isabella and poor Miss Taylor, उसके लिए तो they are poor creatures because their life is disturbed through marriage. He also reminds her again and again that she made promises that she would never marry, but it would not do. Emma hung about him affectionately and smiled and said it must be so, and that he must not class her with Isabella and Mrs. Weston, whose marriages taking them from Harfield had indeed made a melancholy change. But she was not going from Harfield, she should be always there. She was introducing no change in their numbers or their comforts, but for the better, and she was very sure that he would be a great deal the happier for having Mr. Knightley always at hand when he were once got used to the idea. Did he not love Mr. Knightley very much? He would not deny that he did, she was sure. Whom did he ever want to consult on business but Mr. Knightley, who was so useful to him, who was so ready to write his letters, who was so glad to assist him, who was so cheerful, so attentive, so attached to him? Would not he like to have him always on the spot? Yes. So actually she is trying to convince him. That was all very true. Mr. Knightley could not be there too often. He should be glad to see him every day, but they did see him every day as it was. Why could not they go on as they had done? He is still not ready for the change. Mr. Woodhouse could not be soon reconciled, but the worst was overcome. The idea was given time and continual repetition must do the rest. She knew कि अब इसे थोड़ा time लगेगा ये बात समझने में. This leads to chapter 54. In chapter 54, we see that Mr. Knightley has some news for Emma. He tells her that Harriet is to marry Robert Martin. We come to know that Knightley had sent Mr. Martin to London with a package for his brother while Harriet was already there, and Mr. Martin began to spend time with the family. Thus they came closer. Knightley suspects that Emma is upset, but she asserts that she is thrilled, amazed and amused at Harriet's rapid recovery and is actually very happy for her. Emma is thankful that she has not done much harm to Harriet. This shows her genuine concern for her and her genuine love for her. She also feels relieved that she will not have to hide the secret from Harriet regarding her own involvement with Mr. Knightley. Emma and Mr. Knightley go to visit Randall's and find Frank and Jane there. At first, Emma's meeting with Frank is awkward, but soon they are comfortable with each other. Frank's ability to speak lightly of all he and Jane have suffered is not appreciated by Jane anyways. Emma realizes that Mr. Knightley was the most suitable choice for her. Well, again here is some text that takes us towards the neat closure actually very speedily. Time passed on. A few more tomorrows and the party from London would be arriving. It was an alarming change, and Emma was thinking of it one morning as what must bring a great deal to agitate and grieve her when Mr. Knightley came in, and distressing thoughts were put by. After the first chat of play, he was silent and then in a graver tone began, "I have something to tell you, Emma, some news." He is going to talk about actually Harriet. "Good or bad?" said she, quickly looking up in his face. "I don't know which it ought to be called." "Oh, good, I am sure. I see it in your countenance. You are trying not to smile." अब वो उसको समझना शुरू होगी. Now she can understand her very well. Now she can understand him very well. "I'm afraid," said he, composing his features, "I'm very much afraid, my dear Emma, that you will not smile when you hear it." "Indeed? But why so? I can hardly imagine that anything which pleases or amuses you should not please and amuse me too." "There is one subject," he replied, "I hope but one, on which we do not think alike." He paused a moment, again smiling, with his eyes fixed on her face. "Does nothing occur to you? Do not you recollect Harriet Smith?" Her cheeks flushed at the name, and she felt afraid of something, though she knew not what. "Have you heard from her yourself this morning?" cried he. "You have, I believe, and know the whole." "No, I haven't. I know nothing. Pray tell me." So she requests him to tell. "You are prepared for the worst, I see, and very bad it is. Harriet Smith marries Robert Martin." Finally he announces the news. He breaks the news. Emma gave a start which did not seem like being prepared, and her eyes in eager gaze said, "No, this is impossible," but her lips were closed. "It is so indeed," continued Mr. Knightley. "I have it from Robert Martin himself. So the news is authentic. He left me not half an hour ago." She was still looking at him with the most speaking amazement. "You like it, my Emma, as little as I feared. I wish our opinions were the same, but in time they will. Time, you may be sure, will make one or the other of us think differently, and in the meanwhile we need not talk much on the subject." How very considerate he is, how very flexible he is. This is what we notice about Mr. Knightley. "You mistake me, you quite mistake me," she replied, exerting herself. "It is not that such a circumstance would now make me unhappy, but I cannot believe it. It seems an impossibility. You cannot mean to say that Harriet Smith has accepted Robert Martin. You cannot mean that he has even proposed to her again yet. You only mean that he intends it." "I mean that he has done it," answered Mr. Knightley, with smiling but determined decision, "and been accepted." "Good God," she cried. "Well, then," having recourse to her work basket in excuse for leaning down her face and concealing all the exquisite feelings of delight and entertainment which she knew she must be expressing, she added, "Well, now tell me everything. Make this intelligible to me now. Here, where, when. How, where, when." इसको ठीक कर लो please. How, where, when. Let me know it all. I never was more surprised, but it does not make me unhappy. I assure you. How has it been possible? So she's surprised at all that. But of course she's not unhappy, she's happy for her. Looking at this chapter, what we notice in terms of critical appreciation of the chapter, we can say that there is a change in Emma that we notice. It is important to note how Emma has changed. It is important to notice that she is a bit disappointed by Harriet's engagement, for she still harbors some wish that Harriet could find a more high-born husband, but she comes to realize that Harriet's connections are worse than Robert Martin's and that Harriet can only benefit from the match. Emma has now come to agree with Mr. Knightley's earlier view that Harriet's marriage to Robert Martin is the most sensible choice. So her learning by this point is almost complete. This brings us towards the closure of the novel, and this is the last chapter, that is chapter 55. Harriet writes to Emma about Robert Martin and admits that she was silly to consider Mr. Knightley. As she returns from London, Emma is glad to see how completely she has recovered from her infatuation with Mr. Knightley. We also come to know that Harriet's father is a tradesman, and this news makes Emma happy because it provides some kind of social standing to Harriet. We find Harriet and Mr. Martin as the first of the newly engaged couples to marry soon, that is in September. Frank and Jane will be the last to be married in November. Between these two marriages, that is one in September and the other in November, we come to know that Emma would like to be married in October. However, it seems Mr. Woodhouse will never agree. So far he has not agreed. Gradually, however, we would see that he gives in, and finally Emma and Mr. Knightley are married. As the novel closes, we see all the strands are being straightened, all the matches are made now perfectly, and typically, traditionally, the novel ends with everybody living a happy life hereafter. Commenting on the chapter, as I have already said, that everything is resolved and set right. Harriet becomes a respectable member of the society. Emma's father realizes the benefit that he would have out of the marriage of Emma because he thinks that Mr. Knightley's presence at Halffield will keep him safe and happy. Emma herself finally is married to Mr. Knightley. Upon her marriage, she is set to leave Highbury for a vacation to the ocean, the first instance in the novel in which she leaves her home, which shows her horizon is going to be broadened and she is ready to learn and to have new experiences in life. With this, the novel comes to an end. Here are some overall comments on the novel. I would say there is a traditional happy ending to the novel. Everything is resolved. Emma's learning has completed. She is now more open to new experiences. She is also ready to sacrifice some of her independence as she would get married. She also learns that she is not a godmother to Harriet or anybody else. Mr. Knightley is the most suitable match for her and suits her personality as well. She is such a strong and powerful, independent woman that it is only a person like Mr. Knightley, who is so gentle, who is so friendly, who is so considerate, yet who is of such a high social stature, that can be a suitable match for her. This leads us to a final comment on Jane Austen's writing style. I would say that she has a narrow view of life. This is what is always commented about her or she is criticized for. But this narrow view is complete in itself, and it provides minute, microscopic details of whatsoever she shows. She does not show a broader social level issue or a problem. What she deals with a small society, with a small issue such as matchmaking, but details of all that are explored. She actually presents life of her times. The kind of life she lived is completely reflected in a masterful way in her writing. Giving a closing to the novel Emma, I would say actually Jane Austen has presented the issues of money and marriage in Emma. Money as a social status symbol, then the issues of old money and new money in case of Mr. Knightley and Frank, then the issues of elitedom, and all these issues of money and social status are interwoven with the issues of marriage in this society. Marriage is more a kind of a social act that is a symbol of raising social status through being married to a person of a higher rank. This is how it is for a woman. Class consciousness in marriage and matchmaking are all the things that revolve around social status in Jane Austen's times. It is not out of love that people would marry, it would be out of their social need, it would be out of their need for raising their social status or finding proper social status matches that they would marry. It is only at the end of the novel, almost near the end of the novel actually, that Emma agrees to marry Mr. Knightley, having a strong reason, realizing that she loves him and that he loves her. So for the first time we see that the importance of love in the issues of marriage is brought in by Jane Austen. Well, the novel Emma is very important in terms of its projection of women. Women who are presented are typical, traditional and representative of the times. They are the symbols of their social class, the social status they belong to, they reflect that. We see it in the case of all the characters, we see it in the case of Harriet, we can see it in the character of Mrs. Weston, we can see it in the case of Jane Fairfax, and above all we see it in the case of Emma. One thing that makes Emma different from the rest of the women is that she is a strong woman. She has more, you see, the status of a man in the social setup, where she is all powerful, where she is all authoritative, where she is all independent. And it is this that actually creates hindrances in her realization of the needs or the emotions of others, and she thinks of herself as a godmother who would always take care of people like Harriet. However, the whole novel revolves around her learning, where gradually through different events and happenings she learns that she is not a godmother to Harriet or to anybody like her. Rather, she understands that her two very eager efforts of matchmaking can be wrong, as they prove to be quite a few times in the case of Harriet. This leads us towards the end of this whole session, that is a closing session of the novel Emma by Jane Austen. Here are the references of materials that are used, and before I close I would just quickly share a summary of the session, what we have done today. In today's session actually we have covered from chapter 46 to 55 of volume 3, which means we have continued with volume 3 of the novel. Thus in today's session we have finished reading the selected parts of the text and analysis of the novel Emma, and we have completed our critical analysis of the novel. This brings us to a closure of our today's session. Thank you very much.